The dressing room smelled of cedar and old wool, and the particular stillness of a room that had been sealed since its occupant stopped needing it. Cecily Vane stood at the wardrobe with a quill, a catalog ledger, and the precise knowledge of her own smallness in this house. The third week of January, 1819. Outside the windows of Ashmore Park, the grounds lay under 2 inches of snow, and the sky had the flat white quality of a sky that intends to add more before dark. Inside, there was only the cedar smell and the quiet, and the work in front of her. She had been assigned to the late Lord Ashmore's effects by Mrs. Potts, the housekeeper, who had too much else to manage, and who trusted Cecily with careful work, because Cecily had never once given her reason not to. The assignment was simple. Catalog every garment in the wardrobe and the cedar chest, note condition, note whether to preserve or release to the parish. The late Lord's possessions had remained largely untouched for the 4 months since his death, and someone had to begin. And the someone was a lady's maid of 24, whose penmanship was clear, and whose father had been a clergyman, and who had therefore been taught to handle other people's things as if they were sacred. Cecily did not find the task mournful. She found it orderly, and order steadied her. She moved through the wardrobe methodically. The evening coats first, dark wool and velvet, condition noted, each one laid over the chair arm. A blue superfine coat, barely worn. 2 black coats, one with frayed cuffs, a dark red riding coat to be preserved, then the gray one. It was near the back of the wardrobe, half hidden by a longer garment hung in front of it. The gray was a fine merino wool, brass-buttoned, the kind of coat a gentleman wore about his own grounds in the cold months, not formal enough for calls, but too good for barn work. The late Lord's everyday coat, she thought. She lifted it from its hook and shook it gently, feeling for the lapels, and her fingers ran along the hem as a matter of habit. Because cloth told you things if you knew how to ask. The hem was heavier than it should have been. Not much. A ridge, perhaps the width of 2 fingers, running along the inside hem at the front, where the lining was stitched. Cecily held the coat to the winter light and looked. The lining had been restitched. She could see it clearly when she knew to look. The stitching slightly different in color and tension from the original seam. Someone had opened the hem, placed something inside, and sewn it closed again. She ought to have set the coat aside and continued. She knew that. She took the small pair of scissors from her apron pocket, the ones she used for loose threads, and she inserted the point very carefully along the restitched seam and worked it open with the patience she used for every small thing, because the habit of precision did not turn itself off, simply because a task had become unexpected. 3 inches. 4. She worked the opening gently wider, and the thing inside shifted. A document. Folded 4 times. The paper worn at the folds from however long it had lain there, the outer face slightly yellowed. She worked it free with 2 fingers and stood a moment with it in her hand, the coat over her arm and the room very quiet, and the snow outside the window falling now. She could see it had begun, the flakes coming down against the gray sky in total silence. She unfolded it. The handwriting was firm, old-fashioned, the ink brown with age, but legible. She read the first line, and then the second, and then she sat down on the cedar chest because her legs required it, and she read the rest of it through without stopping. It was a will. The last will and testament of Edward Reginald Wycliffe, 6th Earl of Ashmore, written in his own hand, dated the 12th of August, 1817. Witnessed by 2 names she did not recognize, and it differed from the instrument that had governed the estate's settlement these past 4 months in ways she could not yet fully enumerate, but the most essential of which was visible at once. This will, the true will in the late Lord's own hand, contained provisions that the settlement currently in force did not. Her name was not in it. She had no stake in it. She, She was a servant, 24 years old, the daughter of a dead clergyman, sitting on a dead man's cedar chest in January, with a document in her hands that someone had sewn into a coat and hidden. And what happened next would be decided by what she chose to do. She folded it carefully, 4 times, along its existing creases. She put it in her apron pocket beside the scissors. She stood up. She picked up her ledger and her quill, and she hung the gray coat back on its hook, and she noted it in the ledger. Gray merino wool, brass buttons every day, condition good. Then she went downstairs, and she said nothing. The Ashmore household in that 3rd week of January was a house holding itself very still, the way households do when the new order has not quite settled, and the old one has not quite dispersed. The late lord had died the previous September, after a brief illness that moved with the cruel efficiency of fevers in old men, and the legal question of the estate had occupied the 4 months since in the offices of solicitors and the drawing rooms of interested parties, and the result, so far as the household understood it, was that the young lord, Edmund Wycliffe, had inherited as he ought, and the challenge brought by his cousin, Mr. Gerard Wycliffe, had been set aside. Mr. Gerard Wycliffe's solicitor still visited once a fortnight, however, and Mr. Silas Croft, who had been the late lord's solicitor and estate steward, and who had managed the legal settlement, still occupied the estate office every Tuesday and Thursday with the authority of a man who had decided the house needed him and intended to remain. And Mrs. Dorothea Wycliffe, the late lord's sister-in-law, had arrived 3 weeks after the funeral with 2 trunks and a small dog, and the manner of a woman who had not yet received the invitation to leave that she privately expected was coming. These were the governing presences of Ashmore Park in January. Cecily knew them as a servant knows the people above her, by their sounds, their habits, their tones of voice when addressing those beneath them, and the particular quality of the air when they entered a room. Mrs. Dorothea Wycliffe's quality was proprietary. She moved through the house as if conducting an inventory she had rights over, touching chair backs as she passed, pausing at windows to measure the light for her own purposes. She was 58 years old and had spent those years learning the grammar of social authority and deploying it without effort. She dressed in half-mourning that leaned toward lavender, carried a fan in all seasons, and spoke to servants in the tone of someone who has never had reason to remember their names. Mr. Croft's quality was careful. He had long ago made a study of what drew attention, and made himself its opposite: medium height, medium build, eyes that were attentive and gave nothing back. He had been solicitor to the late lord for 11 years, and knew the house's legal bones better than anyone alive. And he understood that knowing a thing was its own form of holding it. The young lord, Edmund Wycliffe, Earl of Ashmore, was 33 years old, and had been in residence for 6 weeks. He was not what the house had expected. The house had expected someone shaped by 4 months of legal wrangling and a contested inheritance to arrive with lawyers in tow and noise around him. Instead, he had arrived on a Tuesday evening in a traveling coat dusted with snow, with a single manservant and 2 trunks, and had gone directly to his father's study and remained there for 4 hours before he emerged and asked for supper on a tray. Cecily had carried the tray. That was how she first saw him. He was standing at the study window when she knocked and entered, his back to the door, looking at the east grounds where the trees were bare against a charcoal sky. He did not turn immediately. She set the tray on the side table and was turning to leave when he spoke. "What is your name?" The question was not unfriendly. It was simply direct. And the directness surprised her because people in this house did not ask servants their names directly. "Vane, my lord, Cecily Vane, lady's maid to Mrs. Wycliffe. My aunt." He turned then. His face was angular and very tired, with dark shadows beneath his eyes that were not from the journey alone. His hair was dark, his jaw unshaven by a day or two, his collar slightly disordered in the way of a man who had loosened it hours ago and not thought of it since. He looked at her for a moment with a quality of attention she could not immediately classify. "Thank you," he said, nodding at the tray. She curtsied and left. In those first weeks, she observed him as she observed everything, quietly, accurately, without expectation of being observed in return. He spent mornings in the study, afternoons on the grounds, sometimes with Croft at his side in a configuration that had the quality of a man being informed and another man doing the informing, a not entirely equal exchange. He spoke to the household staff with a careful courtesy that was not warmth, but was not its absence either. He did not dine with his aunt unless she pressed for it. What he did in those first weeks was pause at the door of his father's dressing room. On the day he finally opened it, he stood with his hand on the frame and did not enter, looking at the cedar chest and the winter light on the floor for a long moment before he turned away. In the upper corridor, he stopped beside the late lord's portrait and stood with his head slightly bent, as if listening to something the canvas could convey that no one else in the house could hear. Cecily saw these moments from the far end of corridors, carrying things that gave her a reason to be in the space without a right to its feeling. She also, in those 3 weeks, kept the document in her apron pocket, taking it out each evening to read again. The words did not change. The difficulty was not understanding what they meant, but deciding what to do with what she understood. The witnessing happened on a Thursday. Mr. Croft came to the servants' hall in the late morning, which was unusual. The estate office was his domain, and he did not venture below stairs without purpose. Mrs. Potts was above stairs dealing with the linen cupboard dispute that had absorbed her all morning. Cecily was at the long table with a torn petticoat and needle. Mr. Croft stood in the doorway and said he required the inventory of the late lord's silver, which Mrs. Potts had been preparing, and that he required it before noon. One of the kitchen girls said she thought it was in Mrs. Potts's room. Mr. Croft said he had not asked where Mrs. Potts kept it. He had asked for it to be produced before noon, and that was 2 different matters. And he expected the household to understand the difference. The kitchen girl flushed and looked at the floor. Mrs. Potts was 64 years old and had served the Wycliffe household for 31 of those years. She was not in the hall to speak for herself. Cecily set down her mending. "I will tell Mrs. Potts you require it," she said. Her voice was level. "She is occupied at present, but I expect she will be down within the hour." Mr. Croft looked at her. "I did not ask for a message relayed, Miss Vane." "No," Cecily agreed. "But you asked for the inventory, and it is Mrs. Potts's work, and she is the right person to produce it. She will have it for you by noon. I will see to it that she knows." The pause that followed was the kind of pause in which a man with authority decides whether a small resistance is worth the effort of flattening. Mr. Croft decided it was not. He said very well, and he left. Cecily did not look up from her mending for a moment. The kitchen girls were very quiet. Then she set down the petticoat, excused herself, and went to find Mrs. Potts. She did not see, until she passed the door on her way out, that the Earl of Ashmore had been standing in the corridor just beyond the servants' hall entrance, and that he had not moved. He was looking at her in the way she had not been able to classify on the first evening in the study. She classified it now. He was looking at her as if he had seen something he had not expected to find in this house, and was revising some set of assumptions accordingly. He said nothing. She curtsied and went up to find Mrs. Potts. By the time she returned to the hall, he was gone. The document sat in her apron pocket through all of it. and grew heavier. The first time the label was spoken, Cecily heard it by accident, and that was perhaps the worst way to hear it, because accidents carry the additional sting of knowing the speaker had no concern for whether you heard or not. She was delivering a note from Mrs. Potts to the drawing room, and the door was ajar, and she had paused to knock when she heard Mrs. Dorothea Wycliffe's voice, calm and carrying. "She is just a maid, Croft. What she thinks she knows about the late Lord's arrangements is not a matter for our concern. She catalogues garments. She does not read them." A pause. Then Croft's voice, quieter, only just audible. "She spent considerable time in the dressing room, as did the groom who brought in the cedar chest and the footman who carried out the rubbish," Mrs. Wycliffe said, and Cecily heard the fan snap open with the particular authority of a woman closing a discussion. A maid is not a person to be alarmed about. She is a person to be ignored, or if necessary dismissed, neither of which requires any particular alarm. Cecily stood very still in the corridor. She knocked on the doorframe and entered and delivered the note, and Mrs. Wycliffe looked at her with an expression of such complete and practiced vacancy that it was worse, in its way, than contempt. And Croft looked at the fire. Cecily returned to the servants' hall with the precise, unrushed step of a woman who had learned long ago that speed in a corridor was an advertisement for distress. That evening, she read the will again. Then she folded it and held it a moment in her hands and thought about her father, who had told her 3 things with any consistency. The truth had weight. Weight did not protect the person carrying it, and that carrying it anyway was the only action left to a person who wished to remain, in their own estimation, whole. He had said this about a great many things during his lifetime, and Cecily had thought him over-earnest, and she thought so still, and she knew he was right. She needed to tell the Earl of Ashmore. The difficulty was that telling him required being heard, and being heard required being taken seriously, and being taken seriously required that he had already formed some opinion of her character that extended beyond her position. She thought of him in the servants' hall doorway, and the way he had looked at her in it, that had no good category. She decided on a Sunday morning. The household was at church. She had reason to be in the library collecting a mending basket she had left there. He was at the library desk not reading, but sitting with a letter in his hand and looking at nothing. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "I beg your pardon, my lord," she said. "I believe I left something." She crossed to the basket in the corner, lifted it, and then stood for a moment, holding it against her side. He was watching her, the letter still in his hand, one hand flat on the desk. "My lord," she said, "I need to speak with you about something I found in the late Lord's dressing room. I am aware that my position makes this request irregular. I would not make it if I believed it could wait." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire in the library grate was low, and the Sunday light was pale and very clean through the window, and in it she could see his face completely. The tiredness that was not of recent origin, the quality of reserve that was not coldness but was grief, shaped into composure over a long time. He set the letter down. "Close the door," he said, "and sit down." She closed the door. She did not sit. She stood facing him across the desk because sitting required a degree of ease she did not have, and she was not willing to perform it. She put her hand in her apron pocket and took out the will and laid it on the desk before him. "I found this sewn into the hem of the late Lord's gray merino coat," she said. The hem had been restitched, not by the original tailor. I opened it while cataloging. The The document is dated August of 1817, and it is in the late Lord's hand. He looked at the folded document on the desk. He did not reach for it immediately. His hand was on the desk beside it, and very still, and she watched the stillness in his face go through something she could not name, something that was not surprise exactly, but was the expression of a man who has been braced for a long time for something, and has not expected it to arrive in this form. "You read it?" he said. "Yes, my lord. I read it to understand what I had found. Not from curiosity." "How long have you had it?" 4 days. He looked at her then, and the look was searching in a way that was uncomfortable to hold, and she held it. "You kept it 4 days, he said, "and you have brought it to me, rather than to Croft." "Croft's name appears in the provisions," she said. "His position as steward would be substantially altered. I did not think it wise." A pause that was different from his other pauses. Then he reached out and unfolded the document, and she watched him read it. The pale Sunday light on his face, and the room very quiet around them both. "If you have stayed this far, you already know what is in this house that no one has been permitted to name. Stay a little longer." He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the desk, with his hands resting on either side of it, and he was quiet for so long that the fire popped and settled before he spoke. "There is a codicil," he said, "on the second page." "Yes," Cecily said. "I saw it." He looked up at her. "Did you understand it?" "It is addressed to you," she said. I read only enough to understand it was personal in nature, and did not read further. This was not quite true. She had read 3 lines before she understood what kind of document it was, and had folded it again. 3 lines had been sufficient to understand that the late Lord had written, in a clear and aging hand, that he hoped his son would find what he had left, and that he loved him. She had not read the rest. Edmund said nothing. He closed his hand over the edge of the desk. His face had gone very still in a way that was not composure now, but the outside of something larger, and she looked away and gave him the privacy a face like that required. When he spoke again, his voice was level in the specific way of a man applying force to a door. "I owe you a considerable accounting," he said, "and you will need a witness when this document is presented. Someone who was in the room when you produced it. Do you have one?" "No," she said. "You will," he said. "I will arrange it." She looked back at him. He was watching her with the attentive stillness from the servants' hall doorway, and this time she did not need to classify it, because she already knew what it was, and the knowledge was warm and slightly dangerous in her chest. She picked up her mending basket. She curtsied. She left. She was in the corridor for perhaps 3 strides when she was aware, without turning, that he had come to the library doorway behind her. She did not hear him. She simply knew it. The way you know a candle has come into a dark room from the warmth that precedes the light. She did not turn. She continued walking, and she was aware of exactly where he stood, and the awareness did not leave her for the rest of the day. What followed should have been straightforward. It was not. Mr. Croft came to her the next evening as she was leaving the servants' hall at the bottom of the back stairs, in the particular location that ensured there was no one close enough to hear. He had the economy of a man who had prepared this conversation. "I am told you have been speaking with Lord Ashmore," he said. "I serve in his household," Cecily said. "I speak with his lordship when my duties require it. I am told it was a private conversation, in the library." Door closed. She looked at him evenly. She did not answer, because anything she said was information she had not chosen to give. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he has decided to be plain. "Whatever you believe you found," he said, "and whatever you believe it means, you should consider your position carefully. A maid who claims to have discovered a document in a dead man's coat is not a credible witness. She is a servant who has been going through a dead man's belongings, and the first question anyone of sense will ask is what else she might have removed. The second question they will ask is whether she reads. The third they will ask is who put her up to it." Cecily felt the cold from the door at her back and the cold from him in front of her, and was careful not to show either. "If you have nothing else, Mr. Croft," she said, "I have duties." "Your position here," he said, "is Mrs. Wycliffe's to grant or remove. She has been good enough to retain you during this transition. I would encourage you not to make her reconsider." He left. She stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, her hands quiet at her sides, her face held very still. Then she went up, and she went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap and understood, in plain terms, the arithmetic of her situation. The document existed. It was legally valid on its face. The document existed, and he had read it. Croft had managed the legal settlement and had the institutional weight of 4 months of administration behind him. And Mrs. Wycliffe would support whatever version of events served her son's interest. And a servant who claimed to have found a will sewn into a coat would, in any public room, be asked the question he had already named. What else had she removed? Her word was not nothing. It was close to nothing. She heard footsteps in the corridor overhead, the particular step she had learned to know in 6 weeks, even and deliberate. The step of a man who carries weight without complaint. A knock at her door. He stood in the corridor of the servants' quarters, with his hat in his hand, and his eyes not composed at all. "Croft has spoken to you," he said. Not a question. "Yes, my lord." "Come to the study. Now, bring the document." She followed him up and told him plainly, without embellishment. He listened without interruption, standing by the fireplace, and when she finished, he said, "You came to me on Sunday knowing he might do this. I thought it likely. You came anyway." "Yes," she said. "I found the document doing honest work. I read it to understand what I had found. I brought it to you because it was yours. I am aware that none of that is provable to someone who has already decided what to think of me. That does not change the order of the facts." He looked at her from the fireplace, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the fire was the only sound in the room, and she was aware of him with the whole of her body, the way you are aware of the one fixed point in a room when everything else is uncertain. "It does not," he agreed. His voice was low. "Cecily." He had not used her given name before. It landed in the room with the weight of a deliberate act, which it was. "My lord," she said very carefully. "Tomorrow evening," he said, "I will ask Croft and my aunt to attend a meeting in the drawing room, along with my cousin and his solicitor. I will ask Mr. Rowe from the village, who was my father's vicar, to be present as an independent witness. And I will ask you to bring the document and to speak to how you found it and where." She thought of the drawing room, the assembled faces, the particular quality of attention that a room full of people of rank gave to a woman in service who claimed to know something they did not. She thought of Croft's eyes at the bottom of the stairs. "Yes, my lord," she said. He took 1 step toward her. Not close. A measured step that halved the distance between them and went no further. And he looked at her with the expression she had seen in the servants' hall doorway and in the library on Sunday, and could not, even now, look it directly without feeling the warmth of it in her chest, like a coal moved to a better position in the grate. "I should have said this on Sunday," he said. You did not have to bring this to me. You could have returned it to the coat and said nothing, and no one would ever have known, and it would have changed nothing in your life, and changed nothing in mine. You chose differently. I could not have done otherwise, she said, and continued to be myself. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not a question. Then he said, "No, I begin to think you could not." She curtsied and left him there, and she walked back through the house to the servants' stairs. And she thought about what it meant that a man of his position had crossed his own study to have the distance between them, and had used her given name, and had looked at her in that way. And she told herself with great firmness to be practical and sensible until the morning. She was not entirely successful. The third time she heard the label second-hand, which was in some ways worse than the others. She was on the upper landing the next afternoon, an hour before the drawing-room assembly was to convene, when she heard the young footman, James, speaking to the under-butler at the bottom of the main stairs. She was not intended to hear it. They had not seen her at the railing. "Mrs. Wycliffe's been telling anyone who'll listen," James said, low and uncomfortable, "that it's all got up. That the maid found nothing, just a maid making up trouble. That Lord Ashmore ought to know better than to listen to just a maid." She held the railing with one hand and looked at the paneled wall opposite, and breathed. Just a maid. The third time, spoken into the air of the house as if the house agreed, as if the house had already rendered its verdict, as if the walls themselves had decided that a woman in an apron could not have found a true thing simply by doing true work. She let go of the railing. She went to her room. She took the document from the box where she had moved it for safekeeping, placed it inside the folded catalog ledger she carried with her, smoothed her apron, and went downstairs. The drawing room at 5 o'clock had the tight, specific fullness of a contested space. Mr. Croft stood by the window. Mrs. Dorothea Wycliffe occupied the largest chair with the precision of a woman staking a claim through placement. Gerard Wycliffe, the cousin, had brought his solicitor, a Mr. Fenn, thin and watchful, and paid to be unhappy. Mr. Rowe, the vicar, sat near the fire with his hands on his knees, and the expression of a man who hoped the evening would not require him to take sides, and suspected it would. Edmund stood at the fireplace in a dark coat. He did not look at Cecily when she entered. She did not expect him to. She stood near the door with her ledger in her hands and waited. Edmund spoke. He spoke plainly and without preamble. He said that a matter had come to his attention that affected the legal settlement of the estate, and that he had asked them all here to be present when it was addressed. He said that a document had been found, which he believed to be his father's final will and testament, and that the document had been found by a member of the household staff whose account he had heard in full, and whose word he had no reason to doubt. Mr. Croft said, his voice careful, "My lord, a household servant discovering a document in the late lord's personal effects is a matter that requires some delicacy. The circumstances under which such a document might come to be found, and by whom, and what else might have been disturbed in the process, are questions that a court would certainly press." Edmund did not move. He said, "Miss Vane, please tell the room where you found the document and how." She stepped forward from the door. She looked at no one in particular and spoke to the room. "I found it in the late Lord Ashmore's gray merino coat," she said. The hem had been restitched by a hand different from the original tailor. I noticed the irregularity while cataloging. I opened the stitching carefully and removed the document inside. "She picked apart a dead man's coat," Croft said. His voice was still careful, but the care had a harder quality now. "With scissors, alone. No witness, and produced a document favorable to the current arrangement." "Not favorable to the current arrangement," Edmund said. The opposite. My lord, Croft said, and there was something in his voice now that was no longer quite careful. With respect, a maid with access to a dead man's belongings and a motive to ingratiate herself with the new lord is not a credible source for a document of this consequence. I put it to the room that this document requires independent verification that we do not have. He said made the way a key is turned in a lock, final, mechanical, entirely certain of its own authority. Cecily had expected it. She had stood in the bottom of the stairs and heard it, and had not flinched. She did not flinch now. She took the document from the ledger and held it out toward the room, toward anyone who would take it. Steady. He crossed the room. Not quickly. 3 even strides, and he was beside her, and he took the document from her hands with care, and he turned to face the room. And the look on his face was not a look she had seen before on him. It was not grief shaped into composure. It was composure without any grief beneath it. Something clear and fixed and very cold. Miss Vane's testimony, he said, is mine. You will address her accordingly. The room was very quiet. The 12 words landed in the silence the description had built, and they landed with the weight of an instrument filed and sealed. Not a declaration of feeling. A declaration of standing. He was saying she is not alone in this room. He was saying her word is attached to his. He was saying, in the grammar of the hierarchy itself, that the verdict was overturned. Mr. Rowe, who had hoped not to take sides and had known he would, leaned forward in his chair and said, May I see the document, my lord? Edmund gave it to him. Mrs. Dorothea Wycliffe said nothing. She looked at Cecily once, with the expression of a woman whose certainties had just encountered something they did not have a category for. And then she looked at her fan, and did not speak again. Mr. Croft looked at the fire. His hands, Cecily noticed, were perfectly still. The stillness of a man who has decided that the next action will need to be calculated somewhere other than here. Mr. Fenn, the cousin's solicitor, said to Mr. Rowe, If I might see it also. The cousin Gerard said nothing. He looked at his hands. Mr. Rowe read the document with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had spent 30 years with difficult texts and knew the value of reading carefully once. Then he held it out to Mr. Fenn and said, The hand is the late Lord's. I know it well. I have 30 years of letters from him. What followed was procedural and took the better part of 2 hours, and Cecily remained in the room by Edmund's quiet instruction, standing near the wall with her ledger in her hands. Croft answered questions with the precision of a man suited to difficult questions who had known this evening might come. His answers were accurate. They were also notably absent of the explanation that would account for why the true will had never been entered into the record of the estate settlement. Mr. Fenn, on behalf of Gerard Wycliffe, asked that question plainly, with the bluntness of a solicitor whose client's interest had just changed shape. Croft said the document had been unknown to him. Nobody pressed the claim. It sat in the air above the fire and did its own work. By 7 o'clock, Mr. Rowe had agreed to attest the handwriting. Mr. Fenn had taken copies of the provisions. Edmund had dispatched a letter to his solicitor in London by express. Croft took his coat from the peg and left the drawing-room with the gait of a man who understands that a managed retreat is not a rout, and that management requires a clear head and a head start. Mrs. Wycliffe remained in her chair until the room had cleared. Then she stood, and she looked at her nephew, and she looked at Cecily, and she said nothing at all, which was perhaps the most complex sentence she had delivered in the entire evening. She left. The dog, from wherever it had spent the proceedings, could be heard trotting after her on the marble of the entrance hall. Edmund stood by the fireplace when they were gone. He looked at Cecily across the cleared room with the expression she had stopped trying to name, and had simply accepted as the one his face produced when she was in it. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat in one of the chairs that had been vacated, still holding the ledger because she had held it for 2 hours, and her hands were accustomed to it. He sat in the chair opposite. He set his hands on his knees and looked at the fire for a moment. "The codicil," he said, "instructed me to find the gray coat. He must have written it first and then sewed the will inside afterward, in case Croft found the will before I returned from London. He trusted me to be thorough enough." He paused. "Or he trusted someone who worked here to be thorough. He always said the household was the heart of the place." She looked at him. He was still looking at the fire, but the quality of his face was open in a way she had not seen before, the long grief somewhere near the surface. "He was right," she said quietly, "about the household." He looked at her then. The firelight was warm and the room was quiet, and outside the windows the January dark had settled, and in it some distant part of the grounds held snow that would still be there in the morning. "I owe you more than I know how to name," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I did the work I was given." "Cecily," he said, and again her given name in his voice was a deliberate act, landing with the same weight as in the study, and this time she did not deflect it. "You did considerably more than that." She set the ledger down on the small table beside her. Her hands felt strange without it. She looked at him, at the dark coat and the firelight, and the face she had been cataloging without permission for 6 weeks. And she said, "What will happen to Croft?" He looked briefly away and back. "That is for the law and my solicitor to determine. I expect it will not be comfortable for him." He paused. "What will happen to you is my concern." She looked at him carefully. "My lord, I do not intend," he said slowly, as if he were choosing the words, with the deliberateness of a man signing a document, "to allow you to continue in a position of service in this house." The words arrived with a quality she had not expected. She sat with them for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "I see. I do not think you do," he said. "Not yet." He looked at her across the firelight with an expression that had nothing managed in it now, nothing shaped into composure, nothing withheld. "I have been in this house 6 weeks, and watching you for most of them. You defended a woman 30 years your senior from a man with the authority to damage her, and you did it with perfect economy and no display. You found a document that upended the legal order of this estate, held it for 4 days, and brought it to the person it belonged to. You stood in this room tonight with Croft calling you a maid, as if it were a verdict, and you were not afraid. I have known men who could not do half of it." She said nothing. Her hands were in her lap and very still. "I am asking," he said, "whether you will allow me to address you differently." The fire settled. One of the lamps guttered and recovered. "You are asking a great deal," she said. "I am," he said. He reached toward her hands in her lap, and then his hand stopped, just short, and he looked at her. "May I?" She looked at his hand, suspended there, and at his face, and thought of the gray coat hanging on its hook and the 4 days she had held what she knew alone, and the 6 weeks of corridors and trays, and his father's portrait, and the plain fact of him standing in the servants' hall doorway, looking at her as if she were the thing he had been searching his father's house for, without knowing it. She thought of her father, who had told her that the truth had weight, and that weight did not protect the one who carried it, and that carrying it anyway was the only action available to a person who wished to remain whole. She held out her hand. He took it. His grip was careful and warm and entirely certain. "Yes," she said. That was the 19th of January, 1819. The legal proceedings with Croft took the better part of the spring. The provisions of the true will were entered into record by April and confirmed by summer. The charitable trust the late Lord had named received its endowment. Mr. Croft found his position substantially and permanently altered. By the following spring, the gray merino coat had been laundered and pressed and folded into the cedar chest in the late Lord's dressing room, where the late Lord had wanted it to remain. And the cedar smell of the room had become the smell of resolved things, and the particular domestic warmth of a house that has found its proper order. Cecily knew the smell because the room was no longer Mrs. Wycliffe's assignment for her. It was her own, and what was in it was hers to tend. There were evenings now when the study fire was going, and Edmund read, and she had brought her mending to the chair opposite because the light there was better, and neither of them said much because the silence between them had the quality of a room that is entirely occupied and needs no arrangement. The codicil she had eventually read in full. The late Lord had written his son's name with the ease of a man who had always known what he felt, and who had trusted, in the end, that the right person would find what he had hidden. Edmund had read the codicil alone the night of the drawing-room meeting, and in the morning he had come to find her in the library with an expression she understood now, that of a man who had learned he had been forgiven by the person whose forgiveness he had needed, and who did not yet know how to carry a thing so much lighter than what he had been carrying before. She had set down her ledger and said nothing. He stood in the library doorway and said with great simplicity, "He knew." "Yes," she said. That was all. It was enough. On an evening in early April, when the grounds outside the library window had begun to find their green again, and the snowdrops had given over to something warmer, she sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the fire and thought of a gray coat on a wardrobe hook and the precise pressure of a hem that was heavier than it should have been, and what it meant that an old man had trusted the person who handled his things carefully to eventually hold him true. She thought the old Lord had been wise. She thought he had been right. Edmund set down his book and looked across at her, and she looked back. And outside the window, a bird was making some announcement about the evening, and the fire was warm, and the cedar smell of the house had become simply the smell of her life. He said her name. She said yes. If Cecily's discovery moved you, leave a word in the comments. This house and the people in it are glad you stayed.